What if the greatest threat to a powerful empire wasn't its enemies outside, but the betrayal growing silently within? In the final phase of World War II, as the Nazi Germany struggled to maintain control, cracks began to form deep inside its own leadership. Among the most shocking revelations was the growing suspicion that one of its most prominent figures, Heinrich Himmler, was no longer loyal to the very regime he helped build. Himmler was not just another official. As the head of the SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, he was considered fiercely devoted to Adolf Hitler. For years, he played a central role in enforcing the regime's brutal policies. However, as the war began to turn against Germany, whispers of secret negotiations and hidden agendas started to emerge. By 1945, the situation had become desperate. Allied forces were advancing rapidly from both the west and the east. German cities were falling, resources were running thin, and the illusion of victory was collapsing. It was in this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that Himmler allegedly began exploring the possibility of negotiating with the Western Allies without Hitler's knowledge. This was not just disobedience. In Hitler's eyes, this was the ultimate act of treason. Reports suggest that Himmler attempted to position himself as a key figure in a potential surrender agreement, hoping to preserve some level of power or influence after the war. If true, this move would not only undermine Hitler's authority but also shatter the unity of the Nazi leadership at a critical moment. When news of these actions reached Hitler, the reaction was explosive. Already under immense pressure and growing increasingly paranoid, Hitler saw this as undeniable proof that betrayal had infected even his closest circle. Himmler, once trusted above almost all others, was now labeled a traitor. The consequences were immediate and severe. Himmler was stripped of his positions and expelled from the Nazi Party. The man who had once stood at the very center of power was suddenly isolated, hunted, and abandoned. This moment marked more than just the fall of a single leader. It symbolized the complete breakdown of trust within the Nazi regime. As loyalty dissolved and desperation took over, the internal collapse of Nazi Germany accelerated rapidly. But the story doesn't end here. What drove Himmler to take such a risky step? Was it fear, ambition, or a calculated attempt to survive the inevitable downfall of the Third Reich? In the next chapter, we will dive deeper into the secret negotiations, the hidden communications, and the dramatic final days that exposed one of the most shocking betrayals in modern history. What happens when a man who built his power on absolute loyalty begins to secretly plan his own survival? As the fall of Nazi Germany became increasingly unavoidable, Heinrich Himmler moved quietly behind the scenes, engaging in actions that would ultimately seal his fate. While the front lines crumbled and the Allies pushed deeper into German territory, Himmler was no longer focused solely on defending the Reich. He was searching for a way out. Through discreet channels, Himmler attempted to open communication with Western Allied forces. One of the most notable intermediaries in these efforts was Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat known for negotiating humanitarian missions during the war. Himmler believed that by presenting himself as a key figure willing to cooperate, he might be able to negotiate a partial surrender specifically to the Western Allies while continuing resistance against the Soviet Union. This strategy revealed a calculated and controversial mindset. Himmler seemed to believe that divisions among the Allies could be exploited. By offering cooperation to Britain and the United States, he hoped to position himself as a useful figure in a post-war Europe shaped by anti-communist interests. But this plan was dangerously flawed. For one, Himmler vastly overestimated his value to the Allies. By this stage of the war, the extent of Nazi crimes was becoming impossible to ignore. Figures like Himmler, deeply associated with the regime's atrocities, were not seen as negotiators but as individuals who would eventually be held accountable. Moreover, secrecy was critical and fragile. Despite efforts to keep these negotiations hidden, information began to leak. Intelligence networks were active on all sides, and rumors of Himmler's independent actions slowly reached the upper ranks of the Nazi leadership. Each passing day increased the risk that Adolf Hitler would discover the truth, and when that truth surfaced, it changed everything. Hitler, already confined in Berlin and facing the collapse of his regime, received confirmation that Himmler had attempted to negotiate without authorization. To him, this was not a desperate act, it was outright betrayal. The idea that one of his most trusted lieutenants had acted independently, possibly even planning for a future without him, was unforgivable. The reaction was swift and brutal. Hitler publicly denounced Himmler, stripping him of all titles and declaring him a traitor to the Reich. Orders were issued for his arrest. In a system built on fear and loyalty, such a fall from grace was catastrophic. Suddenly, Himmler was no longer one of the most powerful men in Germany. He was a fugitive. Isolated and abandoned, he attempted to disappear, reportedly disguising himself and trying to evade capture as Allied forces closed in. The man who once commanded immense authority was now reduced to survival mode, hunted by both enemies and former allies alike. This dramatic turn of events highlighted a deeper truth. The Nazi regime was no longer held together by ideology or unity, but by fear, and that fear was beginning to fracture. As internal trust disintegrated and desperation took control, the final chapter of this story approached rapidly. In the next chapter, we will uncover Himmler's final days, his capture, his last decisions, and the ultimate fate of a man whose ambition and betrayal placed him at the center of one of history's most dramatic downfalls. How does one of the most powerful men in a collapsing empire end his story running, hiding, and ultimately facing the consequences he once believed he could escape? As the collapse of Nazi Germany became undeniable, Heinrich Himmler found himself in a position he had never truly prepared for: total isolation. Stripped of authority, rejected by Adolf Hitler, and abandoned by the system he helped build, Himmler was no longer a figure of power, he was a man on the run. In the chaotic final days of the war, Germany was no longer a unified state but a fragmented landscape of disintegration. Cities were in ruins, command structures had broken down, and millions were fleeing or surrendering. Within this chaos, Himmler attempted to disappear. He adopted a disguise, reportedly taking on the identity of a low-ranking soldier. With altered appearance and forged documents, he moved through a defeated nation, hoping to avoid recognition. It was a desperate gamble, one that reflected both his fall from power and his determination to survive at any cost. But escape was no longer possible. In May 1945, Himmler was captured by British forces near. At first, his disguise seemed to work. He was processed as just another detainee among thousands. However, small details began to raise suspicion. Upon closer inspection and questioning, his true identity was uncovered. The moment of exposure was decisive, realizing that capture meant interrogation, trial, and almost certain execution. Himmler made his final move. Hidden within his possession was a cyanide capsule, an insurance policy against the very fate he now faced. Shortly after being identified, Himmler took the capsule and ended his own life. It was a sudden and dramatic end. The man who had once stood at the peak of power within Nazi Germany chose death over accountability. In doing so, he avoided the courtroom but not the judgment of history. His death marked more than just the end of a single individual. It symbolized the complete destruction of a regime built on control, fear, and absolute loyalty. The betrayal, the secret negotiations, and the final act of self-destruction all revealed a deeper truth. Even the most powerful systems can collapse from within when trust is broken. In the end, Himmler's story is not just about ambition or betrayal, it is about the illusion of control in a world rapidly spiraling beyond it. And perhaps the most haunting question remains: if loyalty was the foundation of the Reich, was its downfall inevitable the moment that loyalty began to crack?